Now it's time to pay tribute to my favorite video game that I've never actually played. Let's get wrecking. Hey there folks, Chuck here, and I am really excited about this build because, first of all, I love this casting. It is a Brendon Vetuskey casting, and you might recognize him from a little show that I also do called Diecast Breakdown. Also, he works for this little organization called Mattel and has designed a lot of amazing cars, and he's a fellow Herbie fan, and yeah, I could fanboy out about Brendon all day, but that's not what this video is about. We are talking about Wreckfest, which is a video game that I very much enjoy and have never played. Right now, I admire it from afar. It reminds me of a video game that I very much enjoyed for the PlayStation 2 that was called Test Drive Eve of Destruction, and it feels like it follows very much in the spirit of that game. But the reason I specifically chose this was because of another diecast organization that I very much enjoy called Diecast Heroes, and they had a magazine issue a while back about video games, and they asked us to pick two of our favorite video game cars. You saw my build for Cisco Heat earlier. Hopefully you did. It's over here up in the corner. Click that. And this is the second build I did, and as luck would have it, this is a relatively new casting here. This is the Hot Wheels 67 Chevelle SS 396, which coincidentally happens to be the vehicle that the Roadcutter from Wreckfest is based on. And it was a very tough decision to figure out which one of the Wreckfest vehicles I wanted to imitate. Like I said, I love this casting, and I've been looking for an excuse to build one, so I figured I'd give it a go. Of course, there are a few things that need to be done to this before it's in Wreckfest shape, and we'll talk about that in the breakdown. Obviously, to compete in Wreckfest, this vehicle would need to have a lot of the ancillary items that a normal stock vehicle would have removed. So we're going to get rid of the glass, the front and rear trim pieces, anything on a demolition derby car that would be knocked off and potentially be a projectile, plus make it look as much like the car from the video game as possible. So that means building a fake core support and headlight buckets where the front grille would be removed, adding that cool little Nerf bar on the front of the bumper, and of course we need to strip that interior, give it a roll cage. We'll need a racing seat and a cowl induction hood. You're going to need some steely wheels on this because you can't go banging up your custom rims in a Wreckfest race, and of course some custom decals and paint. And what's a demolition derby vehicle without some dents, damage, and road grime? Ready? Punch that subscribe button. Let's boogie. Like most modern Hot Wheels, this has the standard body, glass, interior chassis setup. No real surprises there. Again, be careful when you're drilling the plastic chassis. First thing I did was set about stripping the interior. That meant getting rid of the nub steering wheel and chopping out basically everything that wasn't the dashboard, the rear deck, and the door panels. Then drilling a hole with the pin vise for one of my 3D printed wheels. And then it was on to the body, which first I had to prep for the cowl induction hood, which meant sanding off the little decorative vents that were already on the hood. The flap wheel on my Dremel made quick work with that, and getting rid of a few unsightly panel lines. While this would not be something that would be on a normal demolition derby car, the Roadcutter in the video game does feature a side view mirror, so I drilled a hole to make that. And while I had the Dremel tool out, made with adding a few pre-race dents and dings, because ideally you probably wouldn't be putting a particularly nice 67 Chevelle into a race like this. And yes, I will address it now, the Wreckfest version does have glass in it, but that was just too much suspension of disbelief for me on a demolition derby vehicle, so I left it out. This was a new technique that I tried, and I really liked the results because when you do Dremel dents, they look like burr tool gouges. Let's be honest, it doesn't look as good as it could. So I was trying to think of ways to make it look more like dented steel. And I remembered I had some aluminum foil ducting tape, and aluminum foil dents a lot like thin steel does. So I thought, what if I dug some extra deep burrs and then went over the same area with the aluminum foil tape and let the stiffness of the tape create the dents over the gaps. So that's what I did here. I used the natural door panel area to hide some of the tape application, and then did some blending on the back part where I put another piece of tape and just sanded it until it smoothed into the Zamac on the side of the car. And I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. Once the body was done, it was onto the chassis, where I chopped out those little nubs that prevent the axles from getting bent during normal play, because this is going to be a shelf queen, let's be honest. And while I had the Dremel out, chopped away all the pieces on the chassis that would not be on the actual car, which of course meant the grille. Speaking of that, it was time to build the core support, which I did using some ribbed styrene, and then used some ducting tape and a pin vise to create the raised area where the headlight buckets would be, and then drill those holes out. The Nerf bar was pretty straightforward. It was just a Christmas tree hook that I straightened out, drilled a few holes, bent to fit, and used a little CA glue to stick into the top of the bumper. Once the Nerf bar was in place, it was time to finish the interior. I found a 3D printable roll cage that was pretty similar to the one that's in the Roadcutter. So I printed that out and glued it in place in the interior, doing several test fits to make sure that it would actually fit without bumping into the roof of the car. And there's something that I've learned the hard way over and over again. And then it was time to get to paint, but before that I had to add the side view mirror, so I took a junk set of axles, gave it a bend in the nail clippers, and made myself a little round rear view mirror. Oh yeah, I also found a cowl induction hood on Thingiverse and printed it out and chopped all the parts off of it except for the scoop. And after filing the bottom of it flat, I glued it in place. This is a 3D printed racing seat that I had done a while ago and was sitting in one of my drawers. Cut a little brass tubing to make the guides for the new rear axles, and these 3D printed steel wheels that I mocked up from some designs I found on Thingiverse and put together in Tinkercad. I found a steel wheel that I liked and a tire that I liked, and resized them to be 1/64 scale, and they ended up working out quite well. Once the hood had dried, I used some modeling putty to smooth in the rough spots around the cowl induction area, and then file the whole thing smooth. In hindsight, I could have done this whole thing with Milliput and it would have taken a lot less time, but lesson learned. And oh yeah, it still didn't fit. So there was some more trimming to do, but at least it was on the axle side, not on the roll bar side. And it was off to paint. I used black primer this time because the paint I was trying to recreate has this really royal blue shade to it. I wanted to make sure it was a good solid dark blue, so I went with a dark primer, which I feel like also gives the car a bit of a heavier look when it's darker. And I wanted it to feel, as Mark McCott Wheel says, weighty, even though it did not have a metal base. On the areas that I wanted things to be a little lighter, I did go back over with some gray primer, specifically the wheels and tires area. The interior on the Roadcutter that I was imitating was red, and it had red wheels, so I broke that out before going with the blue. And as you can see, the blue really laid on a deep color, and I was really happy with how that turned out. Another thing to keep in mind when you're doing customs like this is to see if there's parts of the body make their way onto the chassis mold. A lot of times the lower valances will end up there, so make sure you touch those up with body paint and make sure they're the color they're supposed to be. I also made sure there was a little overspray because I figured this car was probably shot blue in a field with no masking whatsoever, so there'd be some blue overspray on the underside of the car. And once that was dry, I masked it off and went over the blue with a white. I didn't mask off the doors on purpose because I wanted the blue to have a cooler and darker texture to it than regular white, and that came through really well once the paint was applied. I won't tell you how many fonts I went through trying to find something that looked close to the hand-lettered 700 that's on the actual car, but I really need to be less perfectionist-y when it comes to my decals. But I was able to get that done and find some flame decals that I could merge with some stripe decals and create something that looked very similar to what the Roadcutter in the video game looks like. Because these were larger decals, I had to be very careful with making sure all the air bubbles were out, so there was a lot of maneuvering and fiddling, and then once they were dry, adding some microsol so that they soften up, but not too much because it will dissolve the decal. So around the cowl induction hood was where the most warpage was, and as you can see, it turned out pretty well. The actual dash and rear deck in the car were a warm gray, so I found a nice warm gray to paint that area. And then some black paint for the steering wheel, and since I had the black paint out, or do the front core support area. And for the shifter, I used another Christmas tree hook and added a blob of thick CA glue to the end to become the shift knob. And then once it was dry, I gave it my signature red shift knob. I thought about doing actual seat belts, but I figured between the roll cage and the size of the vehicle, you wouldn't actually be able to see in the interior that well, so I just painted them on using some AK Interactive bold yellow and then some Stuart Simple mirror paint for the buckles. And this actually worked out pretty well. I think people who add seatbelts sometimes can overthink them in 1/64 scale, and sometimes just a little paint to suggest the seatbelt is enough. I used the same warm gray that I used on the interior on the exhaust pipes. I'm still experimenting with ways to make exhaust pipes look more realistic on these cars, and if you really look at old exhaust pipes, a lot of times they are not a cool color. They are a very warm color because of all the corrosion and the rust and the dust that have gathered on them. So I tried warm gray this time around, and I was pretty happy with the results. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I used some old grimy black paint to go over all the areas on the car that I did not want to have attention drawn to that would normally be wreathed in shadow. It was back to the Stuart Simple mirror paint again for the window trim area. Even though I left out the glass, I still wanted to have the window trim look like it was in place. Just add some nice realism to it. Add some rust orange that's a pretty close facsimile to Chevy engine orange, and use that for the underside of the engine. I was very excited about this kit from Vallejo. It's the Wheels and Tracks kit, and I wanted to see if I could turn these resin printed tires into something that looked a little bit more like actual rubber. So let's see how it turns out. This is the black paint that came with the kit, which I was initially not super impressed, but as it dried, it definitely got to a bit more of a soft rubber look to it. And while the tires were drying, I used some Tamiya panel liner to grime up the bottom of the car a bit, and some Nuln oil on the top of the car to grime up the interior. And again, some Stuart Simple mirror paint for the bumpers, and I blacked out the area where the backup lights would have been. And it was time to start adding some wear and tear on the actual car. A little bit of tarnished steel for the freshly scraped spots. I paid extra attention to hard corners and areas where the paint would have gotten worn off from dirt, grime, or just rubbing up against stuff because the paint had been poorly prepped. On the video game version of the car, there were also a lot of flecks of light blue, so I assumed that was either paint chipping up from the light blue color underneath or some more traded paint. So I used the toothpick and the flicky brush method to add a bunch of light blue flecks to the side of the car, and I was really happy with how that turned out. It gave it a good mottled appearance, touching up a few of the spots where I wanted some more heavy chips with a fine paintbrush there. This is more of the paint that comes from that Vallejo wheel and tire kit. In all, I was relatively happy with the wheel and track kit. I don't think it's absolutely necessary for vehicles at this scale, but I could see where at larger ones it would be very useful. But here's where it really started to stand out, was with adding some of the lighter colors and the highlights to make the tires look more like worn rubber. And while I had these various neutrals and earth tones out, I used them to touch up some of the areas where I wanted there to be some either really heavy weathering or enough dark camouflage to hide that this is a 1/64 scale car and not the real thing. I went over certain areas of the car with different levels of varnish, most of it being Vallejo's Ultra Matte finish, and for the areas that I wanted to be shiny, the Vallejo gloss. All right, time to snap everything together and do the final detailing. And that meant adding some earth tones and rust. This is AK Interactive's medium rust deposits. It's a very cool paint. It's a textured paint. It's got a little grit to it, which I really like. And it goes on a little funky, but when it dries, the variance really comes through, and it really does look like rust deposits, to the point where it almost feels like cheating. One of the methods that I've seen that works really well for me is to glob some on in the area that I want it, and then use my finger to dab it off, and then whatever's left is usually about the level of rust that I want it to be. And sometimes that can be just as subtle as a slight brownish tint to an area, just to give the indication that there's some rust showing through. I also used some Tamiya weathering powder, using their rust, soot, and earth pigments to add some grit and grime around the bottom of the car, and some greasy oil paint to recreate the areas that would be greasy and oily. I'm learning to do the wheels last because I frequently hold the cars by the wheels and it tends to take paint off, so I waited until the very end to put on the panel liner. That was that. It was time for the decal and the number and to get ready for the final reveal. But before that, let's take a look at where we started. All right, so one more time, this truly fantastic casting from Hot Wheels, the 1967 Chevelle SS 396 with whoever Osley is on the side. Great tampos on this one too. And let's see where we ended up. There it is, the Wreckfest Roadcutter in all its glory. Well, once this vehicle was done, I ended up sending it off to my good buddy Jay for Jay's Diecast Creations for his roll-off drag racing championship. And it was racing for pinks, and I made it to round 2, and I lost to Diecast Sheriff, so he's got my car. And honestly, I am super happy that he ended up with one of my customs. He was a subscriber early on, and I really liked his channel, and he has gone through a lot. And it was nice to be able to give him something nice and to support my friend Jay, who just had twins, as I understand it. Go over to Jay's Diecast Creation and say congratulations to him and check out. He's got a ton of really great videos and is a content creating machine. But anyway, that's where that vehicle ended up. And I'm realizing really quickly I'm running out of customs, so I got to start making some more, which I will start doing once I get a few more of these videos made, which I will be alternating weeks between doing videos of the builds and videos of Diecast Breakdown. So thank you everyone for your patience as I had to reassess a lot of things in my life and with the project, and all of us were going through some various struggles, and we kept in contact, we kept the faith, and we're glad that things are coming back, and thank you for sticking with us. I am super grateful for all the patrons who have stuck around. I understand some of them left, and that is totally cool. Totally get that. But if you want to support this channel, you can by hitting the join button or by visiting the Patreon link in the description. As always, I want to thank all the amazing people that have stuck with me and all the amazing patrons that we have, both for this show and for the other projects that are happening on Diecast Media Network. There's a lot of cool stuff coming, so be sure to hit subscribe, ring the bell so you don't miss anything. We do live premieres of Diecast Breakdown, and we'll be doing live premieres of future Flying Valiant builds, and those are a lot of fun. We get a lot of great action in the chat. Be sure to swing by and join in the fun. And next week, you should be treated to another episode of Diecast Breakdown. We got a lot of really great guests coming up there. It's been so awesome to have the reception that we've had and the interest from really talented collectors and customizers and cultural icons in Diecast to join us for the show. And you can watch it right here on this channel or on your favorite podcast app. But that's it for me today. As always, I want to thank you for coming along with me for the ride. So until next time, stay fresh, cheese bags.